Russia's battlefield gains look like Putin is in the driver's seat. But are the wheels starting to fall off his war machines? Literally, I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about the state of Russia's armored forces. Okay, so one of the things that you guys can see that's been going on really over the last couple of months has been the fact that Russia has I wouldn't call it sustainable, but has been implementing a strategy around their summer offensive, so to speak. And you can see that in particularly the Donetsk region, right? You can see here is the southern Donetsk near Avdiivka. And you can see over the last, here's the last like week or so, you can see that Russian forces have been making steady creeping advances into Ukrainian territory. And we've watched some of the videos coming from this fighting, and Russia has been pursuing a pretty simple strategy. Small groups of armored forces are conducting essentially human wave attacks, driving down these fixed roadways where they know that there's less likely to be anti-tank mines in place, driving down these fixed paths and trying to just sort of wear out the Ukrainian forces who target them with artillery, drones, anti-tank crews, and occasionally when they get close enough, small arms fire. But it is a costly tactic for Russia. Estimates put the number of Russian forces killed at around 10 to 20,000 in a month typically. And you can multiply that number by 2 or 3 to get the total number of wounded. And so for Russia, this is casualty-wise not fully sustainable. They're able to mobilize around 25,000 people a month. But there's another kind of loss that Russia experiences when they conduct these mechanized attacks, and that is a loss of armored vehicles. So this strategy is core to Russia's offensive. And we've seen actually Russia using this mechanized assault tactic more frequently, especially, again, in the Donetsk area. We didn't see it as much in the Kharkiv and Volchansk fronts, supposedly because Putin launched this offensive before the Russian military was fully ready, and the armored forces they did not have drone jammers installed, meaning that when they were deployed in support of these Russian troops, they were torn apart by Ukrainian FPVs almost instantly. And eventually the Russians simply said, hey, we can't deploy these vehicles here. This fighting just has to be pure light infantry assaults, which has gone exactly the way you'd expect it to for Russia. But the important thing to note is that what we've seen in the last week or so, actually the largest Russian mech assault since October 2023 when they took Avdiivka, or when they launched their big surprise attack in Avdiivka. We've seen a Ukrainian brigade noticed Russian forces making a single simultaneous attack with 11 tanks, 45 armored combat vehicles, and a rare Terminator armored fighting vehicle, which I've literally never heard of because Russia reportedly only can manufacture like 23 of the things. And I am curious, what that is. Let's see if we can punch into Google and learn anything. But the thing to take away that's most important about this is that the Russians are relying on this mech assault tactic to achieve their battlefield objectives, right? Because as we've seen, right, this is what happened the total cessation of Russian advances only occurred when the armored vehicles were stripped away from the battlefield. When Russia tried to conduct its same meat wave attacks using just light infantry, they were stopped literally to the block in places like Volchansk and Hyalboka. And so Russia's realized that if it wants to succeed, it has to have not just manpower, but armored vehicles as well. And without them, the whole thing is going to start to fall apart. Okay, so a BMP Terminator looks like a Cold War armored fighting vehicle designed to support tanks in urban areas. As you can see, it's a BMP with a lot of extra firepower. Rare, but not really like an exceptional vehicle. But of this attack, there were also 12 motorcycles and 200 personnel attacking at dawn from several different directions. This was as of 2 days ago. Brigade said Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance, of course, spotted the columns from a distance. Ukrainian forces tore them apart with artillery, drones, and minefields, blunting the assault. Ukrainian forces taking out 6 tanks, 7 armored combat vehicles, and all 12 of the motorcycles. And the Russian forces retreated after Ukrainians destroyed the first wave of vehicles. But almost certainly, the Russians likely returned, licked their wounds, and went back into the fight again and again as part of their kind of core strategy, which is attrition. Their goal is to simply take these losses and try to either inflict some or simply accept that there'll be a level of losses, absorbing Ukrainian defensive weaponry, and then able to continually advance as Ukrainian forces literally just run out of bullets to shoot them. The literal zombie horde strategy. I'm saying bullets, right? Insert javelins, artillery, FPV drones, whatever. And again, this strategy is working for now. And as ISW points out, though, Russia may not be able to rely on this number of armored vehicles forever, right? And in fact, the Russian military has relied extensively not on building new combat vehicles, of which they can only produce less than 100 a year, it seems, of each type, but refurbishing stocks of Soviet-era weapons, which is much, much cheaper, right? It's particularly armored vehicles. Now, there is some really interesting data here that Russia seems to have this plan to sustain its current tempo of operations in the medium and long term, but it's not clear how it'll do so given the finite stockpiles of old Soviet gear. Right now, some of it can be offset by the Russian defense industry producing individual parts. Right. So, for example, let's say the Russians say, "Hey, listen, we've got this T-62 tank. It's been in storage since the 70s, and its tracks are rusted through. It's possible that a Russian factory can produce new tracks for the T-62 and the rest of it's just old gear and they put the new tracks on and off it rolls, right? Replace tracks with whatever part, But that you're still talking about a vehicle that is 80% old stock. And it was actually noticed in July that hundreds of pieces of old armored vehicles like T-62s and T-55s were moving to the front line, but these vehicles haven't been seen on the battlefield. Russia may be preparing to use them later in the year. And while there's also been some internal documents obtained by a public intel firm that says that the Russian tanks that have been damaged in the last 6 months are widely not getting replacement parts, and that engine shortages mean that when there are damaged tanks, you're seeing more cannibalization. And cannibalization, of course, just refers to the fact that when you have this extensive field of, let's say you have a field of 6 broken vehicles. Well, you say, listen, if we declare one of the broken vehicles, we say these 3 are going to be our most fixable. And you say, we're actually going to make the other ones more broken. We're going to go in and we're going to strip parts off of them and put them in these 3. So what we'll get is 3 vehicles that can roll today, but it's not sustainable because we've made it much harder to repair the other 3 vehicles. So it's effectively destroying a vehicle on the installment plan. And this, again, in the short term, can be a very effective strategy to get combat power to the front lines, but you lose sustainability when you're, again, eating these vehicles, literally cannibalizing them. But we're going to talk about just how deep Russia's Soviet stocks are. But of course, if you feel like you're trying to roll 6 broken vehicles, you don't need to start stripping parts. Instead, you may just need a little boost of caffeine, right? Put a little bit more in your tank with Strike Gum. Strike Gum has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, plus 0 sugar. right? In this one little piece, you've got a refreshing mint flavor. It doesn't taste like basically medicine, okay? I'm not stupid. I know what energy drinks taste like. I drank too many of them in Afghanistan. They all taste like medicine. This refreshing mint flavor, 90 milligrams caffeine, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, no sugar. So check us out. Go to strikegum.com. That's where you can get your veteran discounts, your new user discounts, all of it. Or, of course, you can go to Amazon and just search for Strike Gum. And thanks to everyone that's left us a review on Amazon. Those make a huge difference for us. And, of course, it's made in the USA, veteran owned. We're not out here bankrolling the Chinese, right? When you buy some Strike Gum, you are supporting literally the guys in Denver that manufacture it, me, my co-founder in Pennsylvania. That's it. That's the team. So it's staying right here in the US of A. So thanks again to everybody that's picked up Strike Gum. Okay, let's talk about what Russia's doing to try to get its war machine back up and running, right? Now, according to, this is an article, this is analysis from just a few days ago, just about 9 days ago, that Russia seems to be able to sustainably get about 25,000 soldiers each month to maintain that 470,000 soldiers on the front lines. That hasn't been a problem. Though, again, I say that Russia needs to pay a little bit more than it used to keep that number going. And that number's only going to rise as more and more soldiers, particularly in the wake of inflation, right? Because remember, if you're getting, let's say, $1,000 a month and that's what you offer soldiers, well, every month inflation creeps up in Russia and there's a wage shortage. People are going to say, listen, I can make more working at a factory than I can carrying a gun on the front line. They're going to say, listen, even if I was willing to carry a gun on the front line, life expectancy 48 hours, they say, I'm going to make more money and I don't have to leave. I don't have to get blown up by Ukrainians. So the Russians always have to keep those wages commensurate with the risk level that they're asking people to incur. And that's pretty expensive by Russian standards. But what you can't do, right? Human beings, they always make more of themselves. Russia has a fertility crisis. They're going slowly, but there's always a new crop of Russians turning 18 that Putin salivates over sending to their doom. But here's the thing. You know what doesn't reproduce on its own? Armored vehicles. So the Soviets made huge stocks of armored vehicles. They knew they couldn't compete with elite Western tanks in quality, but they said, you know what? We're an industrial, centrally planned economy. We can make some pretty dog shit tanks and armored vehicles, but we can make a lot of them. And so that's what the Soviets did. They churned out thousands of armored vehicles in peacetime simply as a preparation for war with the West, right? In fact, before it fell apart, the Soviet Union had as many armored vehicles as the entire rest of the globe put together. But the problem is that the Soviet Union fell apart in 30 years ago. And so that means that for 30 years, these old tanks, T-72s, T-62s, and T-55s, which, by the way, were likely out of date when they were manufactured, at least by Western standards, they've been sitting in storage, sometimes for decades, without any kind of maintenance. And so while Russia has about 175 T-90s, that's the tank you might recall that got absolutely shellacked by a Bradley. Again, remember, the U.S. not sending even their top-tier Bradleys, but their 1 or 2 generation old Bradleys, taking out T-90s. That should tell you something right there. That these T-90s, you're not seeing any of them. They might. The analysts expect that new T-90s Russia might be only able to roll out like 28 of them, and that's in part because of the sanctions, right? That's why the West is so hung up about sanctioning sophisticated technology, things like thermal sights and microprocessors that are used to make these kind of tanks, bring them to modern standards that make them modern tanks capable of reaching out, hitting further, fighting at night, maneuvering and seeing itself better. All of that involves a lot of highly sophisticated equipment that is subject to Russian sanction or Western sanctions targeting Russia, right? And so the Russia's ability to build new tanks or these infantry fighting vehicles, obviously we talked about difficult for them to get components, right? And it's not just high-tech stuff. It's sometimes like ball bearings, fuel heaters for diesel engines, high-voltage electrical systems, infrared thermal imagers, right? All of which Russia used to buy from Europe. And to make matters even more difficult, a lot of the time, the Soviet system relied on parts coming from countries who literally aren't a part of Russia anymore, like Ukraine. Ukraine was a chief manufacturer of arms in the Soviet Union. But now that Russia can't rely on Ukraine or Georgia or East Germany, they have to find ways to get these tank parts up and running. Ironically, one of the main producer of turrets for the T-72 tank, and we've all seen those turrets get absolutely smoked, was Kharkiv. Whoops. Maybe Putin should have just stayed on friendly terms with Ukraine. Maybe that would have gone better for them, right? And so, one analyst is saying that between barrels, turrets, tanks, that Russia's going to run out of their ability to refurbish these Soviet stocks, that the tanks and armored vehicles are going to run out long before the people do, right? One ISS estimate, in February this year, Russia may have about 3,200 tanks to draw on that are mothballed in storage, right? And the analyst thinks that up to 70% of those haven't moved 1 inch since the beginning of the war. Likely he knows this from satellite photos. And so that means that of these 3,200 tanks, a lot are going to need some serious parts to get up and running, right? And so they're probably in very poor condition, probably need a lot of parts, and they may have to be cannibalized or extensively refurbished or simply put on the battlefield with non-essential faults, right? What do they call it? Basically a minor fault, right? So for example, they may sit there and go, yeah, your T-72 is supposed to have a thermal sight, but you just got to roll with it. We just won't fight at night. All right, yeah, your T-72, it can't really go in reverse, but don't worry about it. So you're going to see a lot of that, and I think you're going to see a lot of these 3,200 get cannibalized. I imagine about 10% might just become rolling parts depots that they just pull out parts to get the other ones up and running. And so at the current rate of attrition, this analyst thinks that Russian tank and infantry vehicle refurbishment from storage will reach a critical point of exhaustion by the later half of 2025. So about a year from now, given its current rate of attrition, you may see Russia not really able to sustain its armored vehicle operations, right? Unless, of course, Russia pivots to a more defensive posture. Right? And as he points out, it could even become more apparent by the end of summer. Expect Putin's interest in agreeing to a temporary ceasefire to increase simply because he's going to need more time to get more parts to get this thing up and running. Of course, there is so much of this sort of attrition that's happened, not just in Russian or in armored vehicle assets, but it's also happening in Russian air assets. The sea, right? We've talked about the Russian Black Sea Fleet that's lost almost a third to a half of its flotilla. And so this is all a core aspect of the Russian strategy. And I actually hypothesize that perhaps this big surge in Russian fighting in the Donetsk area that's armor heavy might actually be kind of Putin saying, listen, we are going to have to take more time between these assaults in order to refurbish not our people, but actually our armored forces. And I wonder, if that's why in a recent Civdiv video he said, it seems like we're seeing more experienced troops that Russia's putting in the front lines. I think it may actually be better trained troops, that perhaps Russia isn't losing troops as fast as it thinks, and it can actually spend more time training its troops, but they're losing more vehicles, and the vehicles are the constraint. So it remains to be seen just what's going to happen, but one Ukrainian National Guard commander actually suspects that within 1.5 months, Russia may start to have to slow its offensive pace. He says, it's hard, but the enemy's offensive capabilities are not limitless. Look at the losses they're suffering. I think in another month and a half, they'll not be able to conduct active assaults in many directions at once and will be on the defensive in any case, right? And he said, during this time, we need to form our own divisions and prepare them. This is a war. And I think it's possible he's onto something. Again, the worse the Russian equipment is, the faster it's going to get attrited down. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members, including Martin Baum, Gregory Pace, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, James Zola, Chris Holmes, and Chris Gorsuch, and the Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I know you get a lot of value out of those uncensored combat videos on Combat Vet News. So if you want to support the channel and become a member, go check it out. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.